Okay, go ahead.
Well, I really was ready until I saw those photographs. But so Sheena just showed us the dance, the Indian dance and the beautiful poses. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really the dance of the outer shell electrons. Everything in the universe is, and everything that we see and experience, with one exception, is about the dance of outer shell electrons. And today I hope to give you a little bit of a glimpse into why that's so. The only thing that's different in our universe, other than the dance of the electrons, is gravity. Gravity pulls the stars together, and when they explode, they release the atoms, and the atoms make up the universe and everything that we see and experience. But even though science and chemistry in particular tells us all about the dance of the electrons and explains or describes everything we see, we don't get any sense of why it's there or how it came to be. So we get to see the dance, enjoy the dance, but we really are ignorant as to why the dance even exists. So today we're going to be looking at two materials, jade and bronze. And really, to understand them, we have to understand their chemical properties and why their properties are really interesting. So this talk is plagiarized. So I'm glad Kathy Jones is in the Zoom room, because I was trying to create my own PowerPoint presentation and I got a little frustrated finding good images. And then I remembered her talk. So I said, I wonder if I can access her talk, and I did. And so I included many of those images in this presentation. So the first thing I'd like to highlight is the Chinese character for jade. So in Chinese script, in Chinese calligraphy, you basically draw right from left to right and top to bottom. And so here we have three horizontal bones. That's how they're described. So the calligrapher actually tries to create the protrusions at either end of the bone with their calligraphic style and the way they use the brush. So the character in dark green is the symbol for the king or the emperor. But since jade was so important to Chinese emperors, they would often wear jade, and that little dash in light green is the symbol that's added to the king, and that becomes the Chinese symbol for jade. Now, I'm not going to apologize for my Chinese, because in fact, I'm Western, and most Western people lose the ability to hear tonal languages. So in Chinese, the letters that get transliterated into our script are Y and U with a little dash above the U. But in fact, if you see that word and you don't look carefully at the accent marks, you would be mispronouncing it and saying yit in many different ways. There are probably 13 different Chinese words that are all written YU. So yit is the Chinese word for jade. The Chinese believed that jade had magical or mystical properties. And as Pam so ably took us through the tomb rooms, one of those properties was the ability to delay the decay of the body. But people from around the world also believed in the magical or catalyzing properties of this material. And Jing Qi is a word that represents amazing. So one of the adjectives that would describe this material is that it's not only beautiful, but amazing. The Spaniards imported jade back to Europe, and that's where we get the English word for jade. So the Spaniards associated it with the properties to heal kidneys. And so they called it the stone of kidneys. not kidney stones, which we all don't like to have, but the stone of kidneys. And in Spanish, hijada represents the word side or flank of your body. And through the French, it comes down to us as jade. In the earliest extant poetry of China, one of the poets described it as the fairest of stones. And it's also known as the stone of heaven. And here we have a beautiful example of jade artifact. During the Neolithic period, as we described in Pam's lecture, many of the jade that was buried with the ancestors was one of two forms of jade, and that was nephrite. In fact, everything in our collection in the tomb rooms and also in the magnificence of China is nephrite. As to distinguish it from jadeite, which is another form of jade, and I'll be talking about the differences in a little bit. So the axe, if an axe was buried, that would have been the symbol of power or tools that the ancestors could use, the deceased ancestors could use in the afterlife. So I've highlighted two important Neolithic cultures in China, the Longshan and the Liangsu cultures. And if you think of China, this is the way I like to think of the early peoples of China. They came from the West, and they came over perhaps the desert areas through Tibet and Mongolia, and they settled into three main areas. In the northeast, there's the, which in modern Hebei province, you have a culture that developed cultivating millet and pottery. Now, pottery is really important, and we're going to get the next lecture by Katie on ceramics and pottery. But pottery was a very important precursor to the development of Neolithic bronze, and we'll be talking about that. And when you hear about the goblets that for drinking wine in the tomb gallery, those were not grape wines, those were millet wines. So in the north in China, the area is very arid, more arid than in the south, and millet was easily grown there. But in the southern cultures, rice was the predominant produce that was grown there. So the two main river valleys, the Yellow River, where millet grew, and the Yangtze River that produced rice, were also the two cultures that brought jade artifacts into existence. Now, with Nixon opening up China in the 1970s, prior to that, there was really very little investigation into the tomb cultures in China. But when Western scientists, archaeologists, and then they were joined by Chinese archaeologists, the tombs, they've been harvesting all sorts of artifacts from the tombs. And the Liangsu culture is one of the most important ones. But again, if I go back and give you my own limited interpretation, peoples came in from the West, and with that, they brought in from Turkestan stone artifacts of jade that they harvested in the riverbeds in Turkestan, and they brought them into the river valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. They also brought in their primitive, or that's a bad word, but their language and their beginnings of script, and also their beliefs in filial piety and ancestral. So they brought in their ancestral religion into China way before Buddhism and Taoism and all the other religions came in. So these ancient beliefs informed the cultures in Neolithic time. Pam showed us this. This is, I just wanted to show you and remind you of it. This was a suit that was completely covered with about 2,000 jade pieces and linked together with gold threads. And this was, again, the belief that a princess, her body could be prevent decay as she went into the tombs. Here's a close-up of one of the gloves that she had. So the importance of jade was that the emperors prized it. It was linked with ancestral piety, as Pam explained. Also, by the time Confucius came about, the properties of the stone, its beauty, its strength, its smoothness, its purity, those were all linked in his writings to the properties of a good life as far as Confucius was concerned. So those virtues of the stone became associated with the Confucian virtues of the good life. Now, it's a little surprising for us in the West when we think of jade, and we could ask ourselves, what would be the most important color for a jade stone? And in the West, we prize the beautiful green jade. But in China, in fact, mutton fat white was their most precious form of jade. And in our collection, in the Magnificence of China, we have this scepter. And here we see the handle of the scepter in nephrite in this beautiful white jade, which was the most prized color for the Chinese. So that was a little bit of a review, but this is where the science of jade begins. So as I mentioned earlier, there are two main kinds of jade: the ancient Chinese jade, nephrite, which is a silicate. So, So silicon and oxygen form silicates, but the nephrite is bounded with metals, magnesium and iron and calcium, whereas the jadeite is bound to aluminum and sodium. So they're both silicates, but the differences in their properties depend on basically the metals that they are bound with. They're both monoclinic crystals. Now, what that means is if you have like a rectangle or a parallelogram on a plane, and from that you grow a crystal, and you grow the crystal perpendicular to that plane, then you would have a simple structure. But if you grow the crystal at an angle, at an oblique angle away from the plane, then you have what is called a monoclinic structure. Triclinic structures are structures that grow all in different directions. So monoclinic, so they're both monoclinic, meaning that their crystal structure is oblique to the plane that contains the bounding molecules. And here's one of the important differences. Because of the simple structure, relatively simple, of jadeite, it's granular, whereas the nephrite is fibrous. So if you can imagine that in nephrite, the molecules interlock in a fiber, that makes nephrite much, much stronger. Stronger in the sense that if I were to hammer, if I were to hammer jadeite, it would crack more easily than nephrite. The interlocking fibers make nephrite much stronger than the jadeite. However, as it says here, the toughness, the hardness of jade is harder than the hardness of nephrite. What that means is if I take my piece of nephrite that I have here, and you probably can't see this, but if I try to scratch it with a knife, it won't scratch. But if I take my diamond encrusted Dremel tool and do this to it, you can maybe see that I've scratched the surface with diamond. So it takes a harder material than the jade to abrase it, but it cannot be cut with steel or iron. And in fact, since we're talking about the Neolithic period, iron and steel didn't even exist in those days. So in order for the Chinese artisans to work the material, they had to have something harder than the material. So, all that's saying is that jade is slightly harder. Jade is slightly harder than nephrite. Namely, it's harder to abrase and work the material, but nephrite is stronger and will resist impact more than the jadeite. The other properties of it is the refractive index. So basically, since the refractive index of jadeite is higher than that of nephrite, if you have a nice finely polished piece, the light will go through it and bend more, and it'll give it more of a gem-like quality than the nephrite. It's also denser than the nephrite. And because of these properties, it's described as vitreous. So the granular interlocking structure makes it more glass-like. The fiber structure makes nephrite more resin-like. Now, so here, this describes it as vitreous and greasy, but I've talked to gemologists, and they say you can tell the difference in your hand by jadeite feels cool in your hand, whereas nephrite will feel warm. Or to describe it another way, if you have two pieces of what look like identical polished jade, and you place them in your hand, the jadeite will feel cool and will maintain its coolness, whereas the nephrite will warm up more quickly. Now, all this said, the important aspect of jade is its color, as well as its hardness and its ability to be polished. But it comes in all sorts of colors. And where does the color come from? The color comes from the metals that are in the nephrite and in the jadeite. So as the amount of magnesium and iron vary in the composition of the nephrite, you will have different colors given off. So here's where the dance of the electrons comes in. Almost all of the color that we see in nature comes from light interacting with metals. They absorb the light, and then they re-radiate that light in different colors. So like the bee that we're going to see here in a minute, all of those colors, as you pan the surface of the bee, come from the varying concentrations of magnesium and iron that's embedded in that nephrite. Whereas the jadeite is simpler and the color is purer throughout the crystal. But again, the colors depend on the concentrations of aluminum and perhaps sodium that is distributed throughout the crystal structure. So color comes from how the electrons in the embedded metals in the material absorb and re-radiate the light that is incident on them. So here's a quick, simple scale called the Mohs scale that gives you, it's sort of an artificial scale where it defines talc as a 1 and diamond as a 10 on this scale, diamond being among the hardest natural material in nature. And the jade falls somewhere between a 6 and a 7 on this scale. So if you're going to work jade and abrase jade and turn it into a refined work of art, you're going to have to try to abrase it with something harder, like quartz or corundum or diamond. And so what the ancient Chinese had are sands. Now, sands are silicates and some of the sand contains quartz. Or garnet is another material, a precious stone that is around an 8 or a 9 on the Mohs scale. And the Chinese had sands of garnet. Garnet can be crushed easily into a powder, into a sand, and be used to abrase the jadeite. So here we have our bee, which is in the tomb room. And I just love this. I love it from the geometry, the shape, but also I love having my eyes feast on the colors that are given off by the metals that are embedded in this jade. So you can see greens and ochres, and women's eyes are more sensitive to color, so you probably see many more colors than I see. But it's one of our most important objects in our Chinese collection. And just so that we're not tricked, I'm showing this image to show you that there's really no universal proportion for a bee. So the size of the hole relative to the diameter is not a fixed constant. But even though we do not know the original purpose or intent that the Neolithic Chinese had for bee, as we come into the Shang dynasty and later into the Warring States, by that time, the bee became associated with heaven or the cosmos. We don't know what the Neolithic people thought of it, but since this form has remained constant in China, it has been associated with cosmos, their ancient cosmology, or the heavens. And we shouldn't forget the counterpoint to that, that Pam also showed us, were the gongs that came to represent Earth. So you have these two important forms of Chinese jade, ancient Chinese jade, that have remained for thousands of years, the bee and the Kong. So here's an example of what the boulders may have looked like in Neolithic China at that time. Although this photograph comes from the area near Vancouver, outside in British Columbia. So there is a source of nephrite in British Columbia, and that's where this boulder is from. These boulders can be enormous. They can be the size of a human being. And if you look on the outside, they're all encrusted. You wouldn't know necessarily that this beautiful stone was inside it unless you were able to open it up and release the stone. So the question really becomes, how did the ancient Chinese work this material without the modern tools that we have at our disposal? Now, this is not a rhetorical question. I want to see if anybody's paying attention. So please answer this question. Why could this not be the method that the ancient Neolithic Chinese used to carve jade?
The hardness of the material.
What?
The hardness of the material?
Yeah, yes, but why in particular this image has something that tells us this could not have been the way they did it?
No
Could it be the
bronze?
bronze?
The
No
bronze?
bronze. Very good. You all pass it. Okay, no bronze. They did not have bronze. Now, we do not know how they carved it because there are no extant documents. They did not have writing. Very little is left from it. But later, they did use bamboo bows and bronze wires. But we suppose that they used silk threads. And they may have done something very much like this, but with a silk thread, silk being very hard, and then gluing some quartz dust or garnet dust or sands onto the wire, and then going back and forth and abrasing the material. A boulder of that size would have taken months and months to literally slice a piece off of it. They would also have had an assistant that, as the material wore off the silk, they would actually sprinkle the material on there. So as the groove develops, it now allows for extra garnet sand or quartz sand to abrase the material and keep going back and forth. One thing that is amazing about almost all Chinese art is the labor intensity of their work and the time it would have taken to execute this. So we suppose that their saw was something like this, but we know that it couldn't have been with a bronze wire. So we think they were using silk wires. So here's a photograph, which also belies the fact that this is not Neolithic China, of exactly what I was just showing you: a bow being used by four hands. This is called a four-handed bow. And then you have their assistant that would apply the added sand as they were abrasing the material. So here it says even a piece as small as this might have taken a month to be able to slice it apart. The other thing that they had to do is incise features into the stone. And here we have an example of, again, an ancient drill. And so what you would see here is the piece of jade, the piece of jade, and then this bow being wrapped around perhaps a bamboo hard stick with sand glued again to the tip. And as the artisan worked it back and forth, it would be like an example of a primitive drill. This hanging weight would have added weight to it so that pressure would help in the abrasion process on the jadeite. However, we don't do it that way anymore. So now we could do it with coping saws that have diamond encrusted on the edge of it, or I have my little Dremel tool with diamond bits. This is my collection of diamond bits, and here's my nephrite that I bought in New Zealand, and I can work the jade. I can slice it with my coping saw and do the details with a diamond bit drills. I'm going to quickly run through this. You can come back and look at this more, but I want to end by showing you one of the most prized jade pieces. It's in the National Gallery in Taiwan, and it's called Cabbage. And it's one of the most prized works of art in the National Gallery in Taiwan. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
You did a really nice job, Ray.
Okay. Well, I get so nervous this way because I can't see people, and
I know.
My mind doesn't work as well.
You left out my Simpsons.
I know.
It was great seeing old photos of the process or old drawings of their process, because I always discuss this on tours, but it was great getting to see that. So I'm curious if any trainees have any questions about that process, but you described it and showed it so great.
All right.
Looks like Catherine has a question.
Can you hear me? Okay. I want to ask you about the green jade versus the rest of the jade. Was there a particular place that they got the green jade, and rather than the many other colors that they had?
No, not in particular, but by the time you get into some of the later empires and dynasties, much of the nephrite had been lost, and or had been used up. And so they looked to Myanmar to actually as a great source of the jadeite and the kind of green that we associate. I think I missed showing you one slide. Today, I had it on there, but I must have skipped over it. But if you, in the Beijing Olympics, when they gave out the gold medal, on the back of the gold medal was a mutton white jade bee. And on the silver medal was a light green jade bee. And on the bronze medal was the dark green jade bee. So even today, the Chinese still prize the white mutton white as the most important and valuable jade. But any particular boulder would, because of the concentrations of the metals as I described through it, would produce all the different colors, or could produce all the different colors. So finding a pure white section of a jade would be very valuable.
Sandra.
So you showed how abrasion could happen and incising could happen, but I'm just trying to picture now when you think of a sculptor with marble or something, and maybe, you know, all these tools and hammering away and so forth.
Right.
So what did they have? A hunk of diamond, and how did they model?
No, so what they would have had is like a bamboo stick. They would glue some diamond dust. Actually, not diamond. There is evidence, spectroscopic evidence, that there is diamond on some of the surfaces of ancient Chinese jade, but more likely would have been quartz or garnet, and they would literally back and forth work it with their hands or with one of those mechanical drills that they would have had. So everything was done by abrasion. Now today we have, pneumatic tools, electrical tools to do all that, and that's how they do it today. So you can review those photographs of the modern techniques that are in this presentation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go on to the next on piece mold method. Oh, and by the way, you better pay attention because you all have to know how to say, whoops, wrong one. What happened? Stop share. Okay, so we're now going to talk about bronze casting. In my day, we were supposed to be able to describe this whenever we had a bronze work of art. Your teachers will decide how responsible you have to be for this. But so piece mold casting began in the Shang dynasty. But we know that there were some important precursors. And as I mentioned, ceramic technologies were very, very important because, as you'll see, the molds that they used to cast in were basically clay molds that were fired and turned into ceramics that could be able to hold the heat of the molten bronze. Also, they also had to already know how to extract pure copper from the copper ores that were very abundant in China. Pam described the practical and ritualistic uses of bronze, and I came up with this alliterative thing that I'm so pleased with. They used it for wine, water, work, weapons, and worship. So they had a lot of uses of their bronze. The other thing that's really different than especially art in later Western art is that in China, there was a stability of forms. So we're going to be looking in particular at one bronze object, a gu, And if you go into our tomb gallery, you can see that that goo, we have about 6 or 7 of them in one display, and they span hundreds of years with basically no change. The other thing that is important to understand about each of those bronze objects, they're a one of a kind. When it came out of the mold, it came out as a single unique object, and they had to go through the entire process if they were going to make a second one. Unlike today, with the bronze casting methods that we have, once a mold is made, it can be used for multiple copies. The other sort of interesting feature of the decorations is the complete absence of human forms in these decorations. So that we know that many things were taking place during the Neolithic period that then made the casting of bronze during the Shang Dynasty a possibility. And in fact, it had an unparalleled excellence in anywhere in the world. So bronze casting in Shang Dynasty China was without exemplar. So here we have a beautiful object. I mean, I love looking at this. I love looking at the natural patina of how the copper that comes, the bronze is blended with copper, has oxidized on the surface, giving it these beautiful colors. I love the decorations that come. And here we have the Tao Tse mask that Pam talked to us about. It might be actually represented a couple times on this. So how did they execute these decorations? How did they come to make these wine goblets? And as you know, the wine is millet wine, not grape wine. So we're asking the question, how was this made? How was this cast? And so I'm going to take you through my mock-up of how they did this. So the first thing that the artist would do is he would make a clay model, solid clay model of the object he wanted to do. Now, I'm just running through this really quickly, so I didn't take a lot of time to place decorations on the surface. The artist would place as many decorations as he thought feasible at this point and make this clay model. The next thing that's important is he has to insert some keys. Now, keys, when I do this in real life, I get thin aluminum sheets, cut them up, and literally stick them into the clay all the way around, because what a piece mold casting is about, it's about casting it in sections so that when we're able to release the model from the clay, it will separate. And so I've only shown a few of the sections, but you would literally start down at the bottom, go all the way around, and that would allow the mold to separate once it's dried. So piece mold, a goo you can cast with only 2 pieces. Other more complicated models might take more than 2 pieces. So here I'm showing the simplest. So you would insert the keys, and now this is also very important. You would cover the surface with a releasing agent. When I'm doing actual modeling, I use soap. I'm not sure what kind of releasing agent they would have used back in Neolithic China or Shang Dynasty, but you had to cover it with some material that would allow the model inside to easily separate from the clay mold. So once you had your registers, your keys in place, you would cover the whole thing with clay and let it all air dry. Now you have to imagine that these keys, these registers would be protruding out of this clay. You allow the whole thing to dry, you open it up, and then you release the model from the mold. Once that's done, then you take the model out and you shave it down. You completely shave it thin enough so it's going to refit back inside the mold leaving a gap. But before you do that, you go into the mold and you incise more features. So anything you carve into the mold is going to be a positive relief of decoration on the finished product. So you finish decorating by carving additional features into the gap of the mold. Then you reinsert the core. So this model now becomes the core. And then you put in spacer rods to keep it basically hanging inside the mold. You close it back up, whoops, and you tie it with rope or string to hold it together. You, of course, allow for a hole to pour in the molten bronze. And then, oh, sorry, one very important step. Back here, after you've incised the decoration, you have to fire the core and you have to fire the mold. That vitrifies them, that turns them hard so that they can then support the temperature of the bronze when it goes in. So you pour in the bronze carefully and it will fill the gaps in between. And once you allow it to cool, you break the mold, you shatter the mold, and you release the little goo outside of it. And that's the method to make. So here you can come back and review this. This is just everything I've just told you, and you can come back and reread it. But the important point is that once the goo is released from the mold and the mold is shattered, and you'd have to make go through that entire process again to make a second wine goblet. So now that you've been schooled on how to do it, here we have an example of a Jew that's in our collection. And so let me ask you, how many pieces do you think it would take to cast a mold for this? Well, Becky's counting. That's good. So give me a number, Becky.
7.
7. Very close. Any other guesses?
9.
9? You're much too generous. You could probably do it with 9 and 7, but people think that you can probably accomplish it, whoops, with six pieces. So the artist that would created this image here, which is not mine, I found it somewhere. They're using 3 pieces to cast the legs and 3 pieces to cast the body, but there are actually 2 cores because there's the handle on that goo. So you have to have a small clay that you would fire that you would insert in between the center part and the handle in order to cast that handle. Every feature that you can cast has to be done with one casting. They don't cast several times. And so there is compound casting that they can do. They're very creative. So you can actually create things that are interlocking but separate. That takes more effort. But here we see the inner core, this little small core that'll help cast it, and then 6 other pieces to create the goo. So let me pause here because this is really important. Do you sort of understand the overall process? Any questions? So the features that they can get, the decoration comes twofold. One, in the original making of the clay model, but 2, once the mold has been created, they can go back and incise more features into the mold. And then when the mold is assembled and they pour the bronze, and those features are captured. So it's incredible, but it's a one of a kind. And that's what makes it different than modern bronze casting. So again, to achieve this, we need to know a little bit about what bronze is. So bronze is a alloy of copper that has tin and lead. So the amazing thing of adding a little bit of tin to copper is that it makes it harder. Copper is very soft, it's very malleable, it can be hammered, it's incredible material, it's beautiful, but by just adding a small percentage of tin, it hardens the copper. And now you can use it for weapons and other things, but it also reduces the melting point. These are called colligative properties of the material. And it's amazing that adding these little things that goes into the interstitial sites of the copper atoms changes the properties to make it harder, but also make it easier to melt. So the crucibles didn't have to be as high a temperature for bronze as they would have been for copper. So by adding lead, it also increases the fluidity. So in other words, it will pour better into the molds. And the more and more lead you add to the copper, it makes it, changes its color and makes it brighter and brighter. And so the mirrors that we have in our collection would have had a higher concentration of lead that would have made them reflect the light better. So typical castings have about a 7 to 10% amount of tin. One of my sources in the bibliography, you can go into the entire science of the percentages that they find in ancient China, but basically 7 to 10% makes for good casting of bronze. So the other thing that we need to understand is how the copper, the pure copper metal, is extracted from the ores, and that's called smelting. So here you have an example of an actual beautiful chunk of copper oxide. So that green color, again, is evidence of the copper, but the ores can have varying degrees of purity of this copper oxide. So the first thing you would need to do is harvest it from the earth, and there was plenty of it, abundance in China. The next thing you would do is pulverize it, and literally you would hammer it with another stone and like mortar and pestle until you pulverized it to a high degree of fineness. And then what you would do, now this is supposition, because in ancient China, we don't have any sources for this, but it's possible to create pure copper by digging a hole in the ground, igniting a fire in that hole, sticking charcoal or other woody material in there and allow it to burn, and then sprinkle your pulverized copper ore on top of the burning embers, and then cover it with turf, cover it with earth. Insert a billow and blow oxygen into your hole, your little furnace, to keep the fire going and to increase the temperature in your little earthen furnace. And what this does, and this is really important, it actually doesn't allow the complete combustion of carbon. So wood has carbon in it. If you completely combust carbon, it turns into carbon dioxide. But by limiting the amount of oxygen in this little furnace, the carbon burns and turns into carbon monoxide. The carbon monoxide, so the carbon monoxide is a reducing agent. So this is what happens. So the copper oxide, copper is a +2 valence. In other words, it has an absence of 2 electrons. The oxygen, the oxide, has an abundance, an extra 2 electrons. That creates the copper oxide, the neutral compound. But copper is +2 in its valence. Its outer shell electrons are missing. The carbon monoxide binds with the copper oxygen and steals the oxygen, turning it into carbon dioxide. and releasing the pure copper metal in a neutral form. You will hear about reducing atmospheres a lot when you get into ceramics. And so what's being reduced? The copper +2 is becoming copper neutral. So it's reducing the valence state, the oxidation state of the copper. So that's what a reducing atmosphere does. So the fact that you're working these kilns in a reduced oxygen environment doesn't allow for the carbon to completely combust, turning it into a reducing atmosphere that reduces the charge on the copper. Ah, I did it. Okay, moving along. And so even though I love the goos in our collection, probably the dings that we have are the most important. And you have to take the opportunity to make sure that in our gallery, in our display, you look into the 2 dings that we have, because inside there are some ancient Chinese script characters in them. And I think that those characters inside the dings really make them a very important item for our collection. So here's an example of our mirror. And again, the mirror surface is on the back side. It's on the side that we don't see. And remember that the lead content, the increased lead content, would have been used for the mirrors. So this resource down here, I have a 5-minute and 42-second video of the smelting process. It would be really helpful if you watch that, but I think I'll stop unless you want me to click on that and we can see the 5-minute video on how the copper was created in perhaps in ancient times. So I'll stop there. 52 minutes.
Very good. Hey, I'm really impressed that you actually made a goo.
Yeah, well, a cheap version of a goo. I could,
Well,
I have my, huh?
That's amazing. I mean, you have all of that you can do that and bring it to temperature and do that. I'm amazed.
No. I didn't do that. That was all makeup. That was all make believe.
You did.
I mean, the size of that little goo is about this big.
Right. And I know.
And the bronze, I painted it with bronze paint at the end to make it look like it was bronze.
Okay.
That was all make believe.
Okay.
Just to show the process.
You fooled me.
Oh, good. All right. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
Any questions?
Catherine, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. The ding that you showed,
Yeah.
what collection was that from? That was the ding, because it looked a little different than the one in the tomb gallery.
Okay, so there are 2 in the tomb gallery. I'm not sure if that's the one that was in the tomb gallery or not, but you do need to look at the ones in the tomb gallery and look at the calligraphy on the back side, on the inside.
This experiment will be using a type of copper ore.
Oh, sorry.
This was extensively mined
Oh boy.
at the Great Horn Copper Mine, just a few miles down the road.
My video is running in the
First, a small
background.
pit is dug into the ground, here using an antler pick.
Hang on a second.
Question?
I gotta stop this. Here they are.
Oh,
Stop. It's running.
Cool.
Anyway, watch that video. It's really cool. Okay.
Becky?
Yeah, I had a question. You said regarding, okay, you make the mold and then you can use it several times. On that one piece that was very complicated with all the spikes and everything, how would they be able, did they if they could just open it versus shattering it?
Okay,
Or-
so so in those times they only made one of a kind. They could not reuse the mold.
Okay.
They would open the mold. It was only air dried at that point. So the releasing agent, the soap, was very important because you can open it and release the sculpture from the mold.
Okay.
At that point, you can incise more features because the clay is only air dry, it's not hardened. You then fire it. Once you fire it, it crystallizes it. It turns it into ceramic. And then that can take the temperature of the bronze when the bronze is poured in. At the final opening, you have to hammer it open. You hammer it open and the mold is shattered. So you got to start all over again. So each one of those, huh?
Oh, one mold per piece.
Right, one mold per piece.
Back then.
Now today, if I go into my shop at San Diego State, I can create ceramic molds and use them over and over again.
Okay. Thank you.
Diana?
Yes, is the term either bronze or copper sculpture interchangeable when speaking about these works of art? I have the All Victorious Guanyin sculpture, and I see the two terms used, so they can be used interchangeably, or?
No. So my understanding is that the guanyin is copper. Copper is much softer, much more malleable. It could be worked into that sculpture more easily than bronze. And if it was cast, it would have been cast in a different method. It would have been cast in a lost wax method. It's hollow inside, and you can actually go around the back and see that it's hollow. And that's very important because of the script on the back too. So that's really important. Yeah.
So I should refer to it as a copper sculpture.
Copper, right.
Thank you.
Yeah, Diana, that's right. The absence of the lead and tin makes it almost purely copper. So it's different from what Ray was describing.
Anybody else have questions? Yes.
Michelle?
Mine is just a rhetorical statement. It is so labor intensive and so complicated. How did they think of these things?
Yeah, it is pretty amazing.
It's amazing.
So when I started as a student, I knew nothing of Asian art, and I am just overwhelmed by everything they touched. You think this is labor intensive? Wait till you get to lacquer. Lacquer takes a year or two to make the lacquer box that you're going to hear about. And yeah, I mean, everything they touch just takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of labor. And those are the big mystery questions. How did it all start? Like, how did they even begin to smelt ore? It must have happened by some accident that is lost in history, right? In prehistory. So yeah, amazing.
Well, and the other implication of that is that these are obviously luxury goods because the common people couldn't have afforded this kind of labor intensive and expensive material goods. And so when we say these tombs are from the elite, they are from the elite, not from any kind of, they didn't have really a middle class, but you know what I mean? They're from the very top of the society.
So when I tour the tomb galleries, I say this, and now Jim's going to really chide me for this, but to try to get them to understand, I say, imagine that my wife has just died and I have £1 million of gold. Would I bury my gold in my wife's tomb, never to be seen again? And that's what these people did. They buried their most precious stuff, never to be seen or used again. That blows me away. I mean, let that bathe over you.
Well, of course, because they believe their ancestors were using it in the
right.
Empire. So it was, in their worldview, it made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Is that a new question, Diana, or are you?
It is a new question. Regarding the lacquer that you mentioned and that same work of art that we're speaking of, can you tell me why or when that would have been used. You can see it, that's rubbed off, and you can see the red lacquer. So they place the lacquer underneath the gilt.
So, yes.
Enamel.
Yeah. I don't know if that was red lacquer. You would find that out, but it would be underneath. It would be the copper, the red, and then the gilding. And a lot of the gilding is worn off to reveal it, right?
Yeah, but what Ray was talking about with lacquer, we're talking about actual objects made entirely of lacquer. So it's a different process than your Guan Yin had. Hopefully that, and aren't we having a lecture on lacquer? at
Yeah,
some
we're going to get a lecture on lacquer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe hold that till then.
Okay. Sandra?
So these objects of these invaluable objects were buried with the ancestors for them to use them, so they would be used. But then also the ancestors were expected to help to, really help out the descendants. So I just wanted to point out there probably was some self-interest that played a part anyway in burying these riches.
Absolutely.
Like buying the goodwill of your ancestors in a way. Yeah.
Well, in the same way that other cultures would propitiate the gods by offering them animal sacrifices or, grains or foods or whatever, it's always sort of a contract, an exchange. And so you're dealing with the other world, the supernatural, whether it be your dead ancestors or a god or some kind of spirit, because you expect something in return. So absolutely, that's a valid point.
Okay.
Cool.
Ray?
Here's how the copper comes out of your little smelting furnace. It comes out as a little chunk of copper like this.
Okay.
So you build one in your backyard.
Okay. Well, I think we should take a break until 11:30, and then we will hear from Katie.
Richard had a hand up. Is that?
Oh. Richard, where are you?
You took it down, Richard? You don't have a
Oh,
question?
I think he was applauding. I
had a question,
okay.
but I took it down.
Great. Thank you, Ray. That was really interesting. I also appreciated the discussion of the reduction kiln, because of course I've read that over and over again, and reducing the oxygen, but I still don't understand the chemistry, but I understand it more than I did before, why that would cause the color change. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome.
All right. See you all back in 15 or
Okay,
so.
well, 10, yeah, 10.
Oh,
11:30.
is my clock
11:30.
that far off? Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So Michelle, am I
Yes.
going to have a half hour for my presentation?
Oh, no, you can have as much time as you want. We go till 1 o'clock if we need to.
Oh, you do? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I wondered when I needed to start slashing.
No, don't worry about that.
Good. All right, I'm going to use the facilities. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay. Katie, do you want to test your sharing screen?
Okay.
Just to make sure we're okay.
See. I had it up. Mhm. Okay, well, I guess I need to go back to my my Dr. Ernst. Um, huh. Oh, this is it. Oh, this is it. Okay. There we go. There, can you see that?
Yep,
Yeah.
very good.
All right. I just might as well leave it here, right?
Sure.
Oh, never mind.
So do we have Most everybody back? Hard to tell.
The ones who aren't here can't answer.
Ready to go.
I see 1, 2, 3. I see 4 trainees not visible.
Yeah. Here we go.
There we go. They're coming in.
Yeah.
Oh, Joe, are you there? Richard, are you there?
I'm here. I am here,
Okay.
such as I am.
That sounds like Popeye. I am what I am, and that's all that I am.
I am's. I am's what I am's.
And Catherine's here twice. Okay.
Yeah.
Kathy. All right, good.
Okay, well, our next speaker is going to be Katie, and she's going to be talking to us about ceramics, which I know we're all really wanting to learn about. So, oops, you're muted, Katie.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So share my screen, and here we go. So in my mind, the Chinese ceramics is really a continual invention of artistic technology. As Ray and everybody's pointed out, they just never stopped innovating. So basically, China has no rival in the combined length and richness in its ceramic history. The earliest Chinese ceramists were of the Yangshao culture, and they were located along the Yellow River up here by the border with Mongolia. The Chinese ceramists produced sophisticated pottery between 7,000 and 1500 BCE, even before the invention of the potter's wheel. Much of the early ceramic ware was hand-built using a simple coiling technique in which clay was rolled into long ropes that were then pinched and smoothed together to form the body of a vessel. So as simple as that may seem, the ceramic wares had sophisticated manufacturing and design. The ropes of clay were light for their size, another sign of the skill of the makers. So just to give you a comparison, this is what it looks like when an amateur like me does it. See how lumpy bumpy it is? You can see all my thumbprints and everything like that. And this is what it looks like when a skilled artisan does it. This was made in the Yangshao culture. As Ray said, they were agricultural, they grew millet, and hey, they used that millet to brew beer, so they can't be that bad, right? They had their priorities straight. So the potters of the Yangshao culture produced fine, decorated earthenware bowls that were famous for their painted, and they were famous for their painted pottery that was regarded as a peak of pottery manufacturing at that time. Early ceramics were built by coiling, were often placed on mats or large leaves to allow the potter to rotate the vessel during construction rather than walk around it to add the coils of clay. The painted design is made using a slip or a watery clay that's had a mineral pigment like rust or iron oxide added to it. The slip was painted, or it was maybe poured or dipped on the clay body that was not yet fully dry. It was what we call leather hard. Some of the motifs included stylized animal motifs, but the most of them featured abstract designs of a highly refined aesthetic sensibility, integrating a variety of angular and curvilinear geometric motifs, including stripes, zigzags, lozenges, circles, spirals, waves, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes the surface had a muted sheen to it from burnishing it with a smooth stone before firing it. In the late Neolithic period, the fast wheel was developed. So the fast wheel enabled a new process of pottery making to develop called throwing, in which a lump of clay was placed centrally on the wheel, and then as the wheel spun, the clay was squeezed, lifted, and shaped. The process can be used to create thinner walled pieces and a wider variety of shapes, including these stemmed vessels were made by the Longshan kilns. The Longshan culture lived near and around Beijing area. The culture was noted for its high level of skill in pottery making, including the use of pottery wheels. And they produced these thin-walled and highly polished black pottery, otherwise known as eggshell pottery. With the invention of the potter's wheel, potters could now produce many more pots per hour, and it was one of the first steps toward industrialization. So before we go any further, we need to get on the same page for ceramic terminology, because these terms are like the elements of art, only they're for ceramics. There are three classes of ceramics: earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. And each has its own production variables and its own properties. We're going to take a brief deep dive into what goes into making ceramics to get an appreciation for something that may seem simple, but actually chronicles the innovations that change the daily life of human civilization to some degree. So, starting with the base of ceramics, those are the clay bodies. Clay bodies are a uniform, fine-grained soil material that contains water that makes it behave in a more plastic manner. Basic geology is rocks have different mineral compositions. They are in different locations, and they have different methods of erosion that deposit the fine-grained rock in different ways. Most clay bodies are based on deposits with mineral impurities, based on how they were created and how the erosion laid down the particles. So they came in different colors, from white to yellow to brownish black, and that varied based on the amount of iron compound that was included in there. So something like these two clay bodies had much more iron oxide in them than maybe these or some of these lighter ones here. Some clay bodies are naturally occurring deposits of this fine-grained soil material near sources of water. Others are man-made by mining rocks and pulverizing them to a very fine dust and kneading in water, much like making bread dough. So there are three types of ceramics, as I said: earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. And each type is fired in a kiln at a different temperature range. So you can see here, earthenware is fired at 1112 to 1472 degrees Fahrenheit. Stoneware is a little hotter at 2138 to 2264 degrees Fahrenheit. And porcelain is fired at 2228 to 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. Earthenware and stoneware are coarser grained, and they are opaque. The only difference between the two of them is their permeability to water. Earthenware is like the unglazed terracotta pots you use for gardening, so they erode over time after watering your plants. Stoneware is fired at a slightly higher temperature, and it has become impermeable to water. Many of our everyday dishware are stoneware. Porcelain is the grande dame of them all. It's a fine-grained clay body that allows the ceramicist to create extremely thin-walled vessels with flowing lines. It's white because of the chalky materials composing it, and it's fired at such a high temperature that the clay body actually vitrifies or is converted by the heat into something glass-like. As a result, it is translucent when held up to the light, and it rings when you strike it. The clay body for porcelain ceramics was predominantly found in Jingdezhen, China, which is why our dishware we use for entertaining company is colloquially referred to as our China. So, kiln technology was one of the determinants of ceramics capabilities. So in Neolithic kilns, the one on the left here, they had flues directly over the wares, which limited them from achieving high heat. So they could only make earthenwares in those types of kilns. Eventually, they invented or created dragon kilns that were developed that could be hundreds of feet long and, fire over 20,000 wares at the same time. So these kilns had a major firing area at the base. So where's my cursor? Right here. And then it had side ports up the side for additional fires, which magnified the heat and raised the temperature inside the kiln. With no thermostats, the kiln master had to judge the temperature by the color of the fire. Some wares, like porcelain, had to be fired for up to a week of constant heat, so the kilns had to be monitored 24/7. The atmosphere inside the kiln had an impact on the ceramics as well. Controlling the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere had a major effect on the colors produced by the glazes, as we'll see later. The more oxygen that is fully consumed, it's oxidizing in there, and a reduction environment means that not all of the oxygen is consumed by the fire. Oh, and this is what a real live dragon kiln looks like. So other ceramic terms. The piece mold, as we learned from Ray, are objects that are cast into molds of parts of a sculpture. And then, just like they did with the bronzeware, it would be different. They would create a mold for just part of a sculpture. For example, in this camel, if you look under the belly of the camels, you'll see that they're hollow. And their size, hollowness, and elaborate free-form shape indicate that they were created in sections using molds. These sections were allowed to dry for a few days until they were stiff like thick leather. And then they were assembled together to create the whole of the camel, using slip, which is a watered down clay that's used to bind the pieces of the leather-hard clay together. When the sculpture was completely air dried, it was fired in a kiln, and this is called the bisque firing. And usually when ceramics are glazed, they go through at least 2 firings, one for the bisque firing to solidify the sculpture itself, and the second for the glazing. 3 glazes in this particular case were applied to this camel. So a glaze is a watery suspension that contains a vitreous substance which fuses when fired to produce a thin glassy layer on the surface of a ceramic ware. This particular glaze on this camel is called a Sansai glaze. And during the Tang Dynasty, there was an enormous amount of wealth and prosperity and abundance of materials. So their regimented approach to ceramics loosened up, and the dripping of the glazes was considered avant-garde at the time, and therefore it was highly coveted. The size of these camels, I don't know if you've seen them in the galleries, but they're big boys. There's 2 of them actually. I couldn't get a quality picture of the other one to have them nose to nose like they are in the gallery. But the size of them are an indication of the wealth and status of the one who had passed and the family's deep respect for the deceased. These ceramic funerary figures were a way of showing filial piety toward their ancestors, just like Ray said. So Chinese ceramics are often classified by the dynasty in which they were created. The ceramics created during each of these dynasties built upon the knowledge that they had acquired from the dynasty before them. And so what I'm going to talk about is the new and innovation in ceramics that happen in each one of these dynasties. And these dynasties reflect the different cultural belief systems and to some extent the global events that influence the values of the ruler, because it was the ruler that set the agenda and standards from which all of daily life flowed. So let's begin with the Shang dynasty. And you may be saying, whoa, wait a minute, that's not ceramic. This is a wine vessel called a jia, and it's one of my favorite ones in the museum. But it was at this stage that these advanced ceramic skills were used in the manufacture of ancient bronzes. Bronze was a more expensive material and it was more an elaborate process, and therefore it carried greater status in showing your filial piety than ceramics. But consider the complexity of creating the piece molds used in the manufacture of these bronze tomb ritual vessels. They were made out of, the molds were made out of stoneware, and the kiln techniques needed to minimize the shrinkage and warping of the clay molds was fairly high level. And something like this highly complex 3D design was created by carving in the reverse on the inside surfaces of the stoneware clay mold when it was in a leather hard stage. So they had to be able to visualize what they wanted and then create a reverse of that in the mold. The distinctive characteristic of this jia is that the ornamentation on this jia is comprised of a variety of stylized animals. The handle on the lid is in the form of two crested birds standing back to back. A bovine mask adorns the top of the handle, and under the handle, right, it's hard to see in here, but right here is an incision of a figure of a rabbit head, and that references the family name of the vessel's owners. These zoomorphic decorative pieces were very characteristic during the Neolithic period and Shang dynasty. So in the Zhou dynasty, the potters continued to produce wares in the Neolithic and Shang tradition. They decorated them with cord or cloth impressions, but new shapes appeared reflecting changes in rituals and beliefs. The Zhou dynasty was a time of intellectual and creative growth. And towards the end of the Zhou dynasty, the Eastern Zhou created a new type of funerary vase in burnished gray pottery. They were decorated with matte motifs and a scratch design called an anhua, which is Chinese for discrete design. The glaze that they used was an ash glaze. And in the very early days, it was a very simple concoction consisting of ashes from the fire mixed with water and applied to the pottery. During this time, Confucius lived, and his humanistic philosophy had a profound and lasting impact on Chinese culture. And I'm not going to go into Confucianism except to say that oftentimes the prevailing belief systems and and religions manifested themselves in the decorative techniques that they used on their pottery. At the same time, another significant belief system started to emerge during this period, which was Taoism. Many ceramics during the Zhou dynasty imitated bronze vessel shapes, and by the late the Zhou dynasty ceramics actually became popular substitutes for bronzes in burial practices. Stoneware with ash glaze had developed in the Shang, but it continued in the Zhou dynasty. So the first emperor that unified the bulk of China was Qin Shi Huangdi. Qin is from the modern name, the modern name of China derives from his name. He brought an end to more than 2 centuries of political and social turmoil by conquering all the rival states and uniting an area equal to about half of present-day China into an empire that he ruled ruthlessly. He built the Great Wall of China, and that ended up insulating his empire from the outside world. And then he went about unifying his people through centralized bureaucracy, standardized written language, weights and measures, and coinage. He espoused absolute obedience to the state's authority and advocated strict laws and punishment. He replaced feudal lords with talented salaried administrators and rewarded merit rather than favoring high birth. So basically what he did was create governmental bureaucracy. Like many other powerful monarchs, Qin Shi Huangdi began construction of a grandiose tomb that would become his home in the eternal afterlife. This army of 2,000 earthenware, cavalry, chariots, archers, lancers, and hand-to-hand fighters testifies to the high degree of organized manufacturing of ceramics. So this is like the next step up in industrialization and manufacturing. Their creation required a veritable army of sculptors and painters, as well as a large number of huge kilns to create this quantity of life-size figures. The artisans used the same molds over and over again for different parts of the statues, but assembled the parts in many different combinations. Consequently, the stances, the arm positions, the garment folds, the equipment, the coiffures, and the facial features vary, sometimes slightly and sometimes markedly from statue to statue. Additionally, hand modeling of the cast body parts before firing enabled the sculptors to differentiate the figures even more. The Qin painters undoubtedly added further variations to the appearance of the terracotta army. The result of these efforts was a brilliant balance of uniformity and individuality. Qin's dynasty lasted only 14 years. He was a heck of a guy as a ruler. So 3 years after his death, the people rose in revolt, led by a peasant, Liu Bang, who founded the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty further consolidated the coherent political and cultural entity begun under Qin's rule, but in a more benevolent way. It balanced the harshness of the first emperor with the more humane manner of Confucianism. Continuity was restored under the Han, and the people believed that they were all part of one culture, the Han culture. Taoism also assumed a prominent role during this period, and we can see its influence in this pill jar. This covered jar rests on 3 zoomorphic feet. The cover of the ceramic jar is molded in the shape of a deeply grooved mountain rising from surging waves. And figures and animals from popular Taoist stories or legends roam the mountainous and watery scene in the relief around the jar's body. Hill jars are ceramic substitutes for costly bronzes intended for burial with the dead. The form of a hill jar derives from a covered bronze wine jar called a zun. Elaborate cloud spirals filled with mythological and real animals date back as early as the 7th century BCE, and they invoke a realm of the 8 Taoist immortals who reside in the mountains. Tao means the way or universal path. Follow the flow, do not interfere with the natural process of life. Taoism stresses an intuitive awareness and harmony with nature and friends, and we can see how they incorporated those belief systems in the design of this hill jar. Coming on the heels of the Warring States period, a tumultuous era in China's history, Taoism, founded by Lao Tzu a few decades before Confucianism, was instrumental in bringing peace and stability to the people. A good example of its tenets is water and the stone that does not yield. Over time, though, the water wears the stone down, so strength comes from flexibility. The historic Taoist would retreat from society and cultivate in isolation. Some say a typical Chinese is a Taoist at home and Confucius follower in public. So, if we look at this map, it was during the Han Dynasty when China first went out via the Silk Road and made contact with the West, meaning the Greeks and the Romans over here. Prior to this, the history of the world had been a series of unrelated episodes, but for the first time and from then on, history became an organic whole. Affairs of Africa, Europe, and Asia connect, and events have a relationship, and everything contributes toward a single development or key moment in world history. The Tang Dynasty amplified that exploration and the trade along these Silk Roads. The Bactrian camel that we see here again could be considered the lifeblood of the vigorous commercial trade that took place over those desert Silk Roads of Central Asia, especially during the Tang Dynasty from the late 7th to the mid 8th century. The double humps of one protrude above the pack saddle with its projecting boards, load of vegetables, game, and a fanciful pack ornamented with the face of a hairy Central Asian. The glazing is a brilliant splashes of amber on green, light amber, and cream. It wasn't just goods and materials that traveled along these Silk Roads, ideas moved along these trade routes as well. Most important, perhaps, travelers on the Silk Road brought Buddhism to China from India in the 1st century CE, opening a significant new chapter in the history of religion and the history of art in China. Oops. Something happened here. All right. My notes were out of order. That's what happened. So, under the Tang emperors, China entered a period of unequaled magnificence. There was an influx of foreign peoples, wealth, and ideas into China. Tang ceramicists achieved renown and produced thousands of figures of people, domesticated animals, and fantastic creatures. The subjects of the figurines were much more diverse, including Semitic traders and Central Asian musicians. The popularity of the horse as a subject of Chinese art reflects the importance that the emperors placed on the quality of their stables. This riderless horse, colored in the 3-color sans-serif glazing, was particularly prevalent on figures of horses made for the royal tombs near the capital of China during the Tang Dynasty. The breed represented here is powerful in build. Its beautifully arched neck terminates in a small, elegant head. Polo was another foreign fashion that took Tang China by storm. Introduced to China by the 6th century from Iran through Central Asia and India, it was played by both men and women. The stick, which would have been held originally in the hand of the mounted polo player shown here, was curved with an end like a crescent moon. The rider's skillful horsemanship and chance for a good whack are evident as he leans into the shot with his horse in full flying gallop. The Song dynasty is when we begin to see more sophistication in glazing techniques, made possible by the confluence of kiln technology and raw materials for clay bodies. There are 3 coloring agents used in glazes: copper, cobalt, and iron oxides. But glaze is not like pigments in paint. If a little iron makes it light green, more iron won't make it brighter green. In fact, each of these coloring agents, depending on the temperature of firing and the atmosphere in the kiln, can produce colors as varied as yellow to red to dark brown to green. Minuscule changes in glaze composition make huge differences in color. In addition, the level of oxygen in the atmosphere inside the kiln affects the outcome of the color. In the case of a celadon glaze, the amount of oxygen in the kiln must be reduced to achieve the alchemy necessary for producing the icy blue-green that we see in this bowl on the left here. Chinese monochrome porcelain is said to have its roots in the Song dynasty, which was from 960 to about 1279. Chinese monochrome porcelain is considered to be one of the ceramic world's great achievements. Celadon became especially popular and refined during the Song dynasty. This may be partly because sources of jade, like Turkmenistan, were intermittently cut off by border disputes during this time. In the Neolithic period, jade was viewed as the link between earth and heaven, a bridge to immortality, and believed to have the magical quality to protect the dead. It was also a symbol of wealth and good fortune. So the wares that come closest in appearance and touch to jade come from the kilns at Longquan, or literally meaning dragon spring, southwest of Shanghai in the Zhejiang province. Sorry for butchering the Chinese. During the late 12th and 13th centuries, the Southern Song dynasty period. The glaze is rich and thick, yet it fits the body of the ceramic without concealing the quiet lines of carved pattern or subtly molded shapes in the decoration. Like this jar here with the cover and the 5 spouts. You can barely make, I don't hope you can barely make out the incised pattern on the body of the jar, and then these tiny little figure, the fox on the lid of it, is not overwhelmed by the thickness of the glaze. By the 14th century, green wares or celadon ware were in great demand all over Asia, particularly in the Muslim world. And in every market, there was an attempt to produce a homegrown version of the Chinese original. There appears to be a wider variety of carving or shaving to create decorative patterns on leathered hard clay before firing beginning in the Song dynasty. The delicate simplicity of incised lines simulating the calligraphic brush strokes as seen on the bowl were popular during the Song dynasty. Similarly, we can see an incised pattern on the body of the jar. Other decorative carving techniques include the relief decoration created by not carving the motif, but carving away the background, as seen in this vase on the right, or the open work of where the entire background around the motif is removed, creating this lace-like appearance. So there were many motifs decorating the ceramic ware, and they represent different meanings. Many times they had double entendres because of the tonal nature of Chinese. So the word red or hong, pronounced one way means red, but pronounced in another way means enormous. Or fu, which means bat, or it sounds the same as blessings. So an upside down bat means blessings have arrived. Nature was the prime inspiration for the Song Dynasty motifs, reflecting the popularity of Taoism during this time. However, as Buddhism spread throughout China, more Buddhist motifs were incorporated into the designs, like floral systems, symbols of lotus for purity, or the pine, bamboo, and plum blossom for vitality and rebirth. The dragon, that's Taoism, sorry. So this phoenix here and the dragon would be the yin and the yang of Taoism. The dragon ruling the clouds and rain, and the phoenix being the female form that governs the land and earth. Underglaze reds. So underglazes are pigments that are applied to the leather hard sculpture or work of art. And then they were covered with a clear, transparent glaze. And underglazed reds were very difficult to achieve. So this pilgrim flask, that's another thing, that there were many, many forms that were developing, and pilgrim flask was one of the forms that was created. Both the blue cobalt and the red copper are underglazed in this particular work of art. The underglazed reds are made from copper or iron pigments and are hard to keep from turning brown. So it's rarely attempted compared with the blue, which is based on a cobalt, which is less affected by the atmosphere in the kiln. So between these two, the vase with the dragon and the pilgrim flask, which of these vases was made for the imperial household, do you think? Well, that's a rhetorical question, because I'm going to tell you the answer. This one here, because it has this motif of a flaming pearl, which represents spiritual energy, wisdom, prosperity, power, immortality, thunder, or the moon. By the Yuan period, Chinese potters had extended their mastery to fully develop porcelains, a technically demanding medium. No other art form has achieved such worldwide admiration, inspired such imitation, or penetrated so deeply into everyday life as porcelain. Chinese potters had a breakthrough of kiln and firing technology with porcelain. Potters developed a white body, clay body, with a clear glaze fired at a very high temperature. Blue and white ware were created by painting a cobalt blue underglaze and covering it with this clear glaze. So it took a lot of trial and error to create this clear glaze. They started with ash glaze, interestingly enough. Remember how we saw how that in the, where that was, it created the black pottery during the Zhou dynasty, sorry. And also the black pottery, the eggshell was probably an ash application that was burnished with a stone. But eventually, through trial and error, they were able to make modifications and created this clear glaze. So the the Yuan dynasty was based on the Mongols that invaded, and often they initially destroyed much of the art of their defeated enemies. But later they viewed these arts as valuable goods for trade. So they wanted to preserve that to keep the economy booming. Although there were hundreds of important kiln centers throughout China prior to the Yuan, the center at Jingdezhen gradually superseded these other sites. Jingdezhen's dominance can be attributed to the optimal geographical site with excellent kaolin deposits and pentons that were necessary for creating this white clay body. It was also surrounded by forests, which would provided a bountiful source for kiln fuel. And there were rivers for the transportation of these thousands and thousands of wares that were exported across the Silk Roads. Areas like Jingdezhen were geologically lucky because they had large deposits of this, especially pure kaolin and pentons, that don't exist in many parts of the world. Drawing on their experience of organizing for a large manufacturing process during the terracotta period, China began exporting large quantities of blue and white ware to Europe, and Europeans went crazy for the Chinese blue and white ware. The fine craftsmanship, the fragile state of the pottery, the exotic nature of the pattern motifs, and the expense of importing them were likely large draws for the wealthy Europeans. Additionally, there was a high amount of secrecy of the process guarded by China. So there was a large demand for something that had a very controlled supply source. Amazingly, Europeans were not able to master the production of porcelain until the 18th century, 600 years later. So China dominated the porcelain trade for 600 years. The Chinese developed a number of types and forms of vessels. The one on the left is a kong, as Ray talked about. It's a square jar that replicates an ancient jade kong with its square shape symbolizing the earth. And if you look at this diagram, the inside or the interior is a round shape symbolizing heaven. And we can see the yin and yang, like the dragon and the phoenix in there, representing the Tao belief of the unity of heaven and earth. The next dynasty was the Ming dynasty. Now, keep in mind, all of this stuff continues to be built upon and manufactured. But in the Ming dynasty, it was when exports of Chinese porcelain really reached its peak. Their production and manufacturing capabilities just were enormous. And originating during the Ming dynasty under the Yongle reign, this guy right here is Mr. Yongle. In Jingdezhen, sweet white ware resembling white jade, and remember Ray said that white jade was the most prized, was created due to the minute fragments of quartz and mica found in their clay-bodied source. Sweet white ware is notable for its tranquil and elegant character, injecting new vitality into the tradition of white glazed porcelain. At a time when multicolored ceramic ware was thought to be garish, so now they've outgrown the camels and the horses of Sensai type glazes, sweet white ware became popular during this guy's reign, Yongle's reign. It reflected the Confucian ideal of humility. White is the color of mourning. And some have theorized that the Yongle emperor had his teenage nephew killed so that he could assume the throne. And by surrounding himself with sweet white ware, he was showing filial piety to his father, the emperor who founded the Ming dynasty, and publicizing that he was the dutiful son and rightful heir to the great emperor. The one on the right is another form of vessel called so the one on the left is another form of vessel called the Meiping vase. And it's characterized by a short upright neck and broad high shoulders that taper towards the base. Meiping means plum blossom, and this vase is designed to showcase one flowering branch of a plum tree as a sign of rebirth and resilience after a long, cold winter. In keeping with the simple yet stately elegant contours, the surface is covered with a very subtle, barely discernible incised peony scrolls and bands of floral and vine motifs that do not interrupt the perfection of the vessel's contours. I hope you can see that. I blew it up as much as I could, but I don't know if it might be blurry. The point of the inside's design, which is called an enroy, which means secret decoration, was to even further increase the translucency in parts of this very thin-walled vessel. And I don't know if anyone's ever worked with ceramics, but I took ceramics, one of ceramics too, and I'm telling you, working with porcelain is really difficult because it is very flexible, very plastic. And it's creating these thin walls and having it maintain its shape is really takes some expertise. The work of art on the right is the Dipper Mother. Oh, on the left, sorry. The work of art on the left is the Dipper Mother. And this Taoist mother goddess, whose cult arose in the 15th century, reveals the importance of astronomy in Taoist practice. According to legend, the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, or Ursa Major constellation, were born from lotus flowers that grew in a pond while she, a virtuous queen, was bathing and felt the movement of the Tao. Seated on a lotus pedestal, she holds the sun and the moon in her topmost pair of hands. This type of porcelain was called blanc de Chine, literally translated white from China. And it was made in Dehua, a town in the Fujian province along China's southeast coast. The Qing dynasty was considered the last outstanding period of ceramic production in China. And in fact, it was considered the last important dynasty. Monochrome ware became especially popular in the reign of the Qing Emperor Kangxi. He reigned from 1661 to 1722. The monochrome ware, while simple in design, was very hard to produce. And single color glazing is considered one of the most intriguing technologies seen in Chinese ceramics, with each having a unique color formula. The porcelains were produced through new techniques and innovative kiln technology. The kilns were gourd-shaped with a large firing chamber at the front, connecting to a smaller chamber with a lower roof and a chimney. The gourd-shaped kiln could produce large quantities of porcelain fired at the very high temperatures. By blocking the kiln vents to restrict airflow to the fire, these innovative kilns gave potters better control of atmospheric conditions, such as oxygen, and reduced gas byproducts like hydrogen and carbon monoxide. This allowed for firing many of these unique colors so vibrant that no further decor was needed to balance the simplicity of the forms. These striking white rims are caused by the fluid properties of these glazes flowing off the raised areas. Most blue tint porcelains would have applied cobalt, a material that was imported from Iran, Afghanistan, and India prior to the 15th century. After the Ming Dynasty, domestic cobalt was used for light blue, while imported cobalt was still used for highly refined blue production. This base, in a rich dark blue, was likely produced with Zhenjiang local cobalt after the 18th century, when the Chinese improved and refined the process of purifying cobalt to create an intensive blue in porcelains. The ox blue, or sang de boeuf glaze on the right here, was dusted onto a piece downwards and produced a kind of striped effect. The copper-based pigments of these red wares were notoriously finicky to work with and involved cycles of oxidation and then reduction, requiring potters to carefully manipulate the kiln's temperature and oxygen content in order to obtain the desired effect. It took supreme skill to achieve the mottled colors one sees in the peach bloom glaze, the most highly prized type of glaze by collectors. Traditionally, this glaze was blown through bamboo tubes covered with a fine silk to achieve this mottled effect. And these were technically challenging due to the need for separate reductive and oxidative firing cycles. So these were fired on multiple times. And as I said, the Qing dynasty was the last great dynasty for innovation in ceramics. That brings us to the end of the Chinese journey to master the creation of ceramic ware as we know it today. After the Qing dynasty, Mao Zedong and the Communist Revolution took power in China, and the Republic of China was established in 1912. Although it didn't bring an end to the traditional themes and modes of Chinese art, Marxism inspired a social realism that broke drastically with the past. That's all, folks. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question regarding the glazes. You said there was the underglaze and the overglaze. The underglaze you put on, well, first you fire it to get the clay hard, and then you put the underglaze on it. And then
actually, no. The underglaze is applied to, oh, wait. Yeah, you're right. So you would have a bisque firing, and then you put the underglaze on, and then at the same time, you would let that dry, and then you would put the clear glaze over that, and then you would fire it again.
So the clear glaze is like the overglaze.
It's like, well, it's like the glaze. So the
Okay.
other glaze is more like painting the design on there.
Okay.
And then the clear glaze is like the glazing part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But let me tell you, it's not easy to get that clear glaze, even if you have the correct chemical composition concoction in the clear glaze thing. If you put too much of it, then it gets milky and cloudy. And so generally that's what all of mine turned out like when I was taking ceramics. So just FYI.
And the Celadon, is that, you mentioned that in the Song Dynasty. Is that like, it's too early, is that like pottery, not porcelain?
Well, the glaze could be applied to the stoneware, but you know, porcelain was close on the heels. That was kind of when they sort of started to get their act together with the kiln. And as soon as they had innovated the kiln that was able to fire at a higher temperature, that was when the porcelain kicked in. So the kiln technology was sort of rapidly evolving during the Song Dynasty. So there are porcelain things with Celadon glaze on them.
So Celadon is like a glaze almost. Is that?
It's a type of glaze.
It's a type of glaze. Okay.
Yeah. It refers to the color, and it's based on like it's a European term for it that's based on a character in some French play that wore flowing light green garments in it. So.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Can I weigh in on the underglazing?
Sure.
So in the blue and white, you described it properly in your talk. So in the blue and white, when you have the kaolin clay and you apply the blue cobalt pigment, has not been fired yet. And the kaolin clay has the property that it will allow the cobalt to infuse into it and maintain its location under firing. So it doesn't diffuse through the material. And that was one very important part. So the crispness of the image was maintained because the pigment would be infused into the kaolin. And then the glaze is applied on top of it, that clear glaze, which was super important, and then fired. It was a single firing for the blue and white. But there are lots of variations on it. So you are right that sometimes you can bisque fire, then decorate, then glaze, and then fire. So there are multiple variations and multiple stages, but the prized blue and white was only under one firing.
Thanks, Ray. That's what I needed.
Welcome.
Anybody else have questions for Katie? Yeah. That was really interesting, Katie. Thank you for putting that all into perspective for us, because it is so important, not only in China, but we'll see in Korea and Japan too. But those processes all were invented in China. And thank you.
Do we have any more on the agenda, or can I throw in one little story?
No, we're all done as far as the agenda goes.
Great. Well, I wanted to follow up just briefly on what Katie was talking about with the Europeans lagging behind, if you will, on the development of porcelain in China. And it was such a prized import. In the 18th century, the Europeans were frustrated, particularly the English, because they were trying to emulate, Chinese porcelain. And for some reason, they discovered that adding bone ash to their kaolin clay and some other minerals allowed them to make a very thin-walled porcelain of great strength. Something about the composition of the bone sort of melded, I guess. We can probably get Ray to tell us all about the chemical process, but we don't have another hour. So we will just tell you this funny little story. In a former life, while I was attending college, I worked at Robinson's department store. I don't know if any of you remember Robinson's chain. And for a while, I was the manager of the China Crystal Silver department. And we were opening a brand new store. And we had all kinds of special events coming to the store to, drum up publicity and whatever. And we had Lord Wedgwood, literally Lord Wedgwood come out from Britain to do a demonstration of the bone china that Wedgwood produced. And his demonstration involved placing 4 Wedgwood teacups upside down on the floor inside the store. And then they drove in a full Rolls Royce and they lifted the Rolls Royce up and put a teacup under each wheel. And the 4 bone china Wedgwood cups supported the weight of the Rolls Royce. So this was our big, aha moment, and all the customers walked in and saw this there. And it was up there for a couple of weeks. It was really quite amazing. So I just wanted to say that addition of the bone is what, made that English porcelain so very, very strong. I don't know if we could do the same test with a Chinese porcelain cup or not, but I thought you might enjoy kind of hearing about that.
Yeah. I wish you had pictures of that.
I do too. I don't know. We had all kinds of pictures, but I seem to have lost them. I've moved 3 times since then, and I don't know where they ended up.
So the shape of the cups is very important too. So it had to be a catenary, which not a parabola, but a catenary, which holds the forces and distributes the forces the best down. So yeah, so the shape is really important.
Yeah, they were kind of those bell-shaped cups, those.
Yeah.
Got to have my pinky up. Anyhow, that was just an amusing little story. And it does, I think this is one of my favorite themes throughout all the trainings is the cross-cultural interactions between different parts of the world, different cultures. When we get to Europe and we start talking about Dutch blue and white porcelain, I think it'll be interesting to make those comparisons as well. So that's all I had to contribute. So back to you, Michelle.
Okay. Well, so Wednesday, we have reports. So we will take care of that. I don't think, I think I probably have an exercise on the syllabus. So I will let you know what that is on Wednesday, but you don't have to do anything in advance for the exercise. We'll just do that at the museum. Has everybody been able to get their sources, find books, either in the Docent library or in the museum library? Are you finding what you need? And so on. Okay, good. And I think we're still waiting for reports from a couple of you sometime today. And we look forward to seeing everybody present their reports for the first time in a very long time in the actual museum in front of their actual works of art. So we're all very excited about that. And anything else? Anybody? Questions? Okay. Well, I think we can let you go a little early this time. So thank you.
And thanks to Katie and Ray.
Yes, absolutely.
Have a good day. We'll see you